So, yeah, it's been a fun learning experience. I'm glad that we did it just for a week before, because I was going to invest in getting a puppy. So I'm glad we did not invest in a puppy.
I guess. Here, I shall alight myself.
All right, so welcome back, folks. We'll give everybody just another minute to join us. Hope everybody had a great lunch. We had some delicious empanadas. I just very quickly downed a spinach and a corn empanada from La Colada shop. I know, I actually made them check. I was like, oh, okay. That would be terrible. As you know, I start talking and they rush in. Stop, turn off the camera. Alrighty. So I'll get started in just a second. Oh, there's Andy. So see who we got here. I'm just gonna pull up the chat feature. Great, so I can see it. Just in case there are questions. All righty. Let's go ahead and
I'm wondering why I keep leaning in. It's to read the chats.
No worries, that's totally fine. So yeah, definitely, you know, we have chats, we can try to get to those.
Took me about 20 minutes to figure out how to do that. Boomer.
It's fine. I do book calls with my mom for the book group on Monday nights, and it's always entertaining. It's fun. I love my mother. All right, so welcome back, everyone. Hope you guys had a great either lunch, if it's lunchtime for you, or you know, a snack perhaps to keep you going through this afternoon. My name is Margaret. I am the managing director of the Unfunded list. I realized the other day that in fall of 2021, it will be my 5th year with Unfunded list in some aspect. My first round was fall of 2016, which is just crazy to think that we've been doing this for 5 years. Dave, obviously longer than I have, but still, that's a long time. So we're gonna get into some kind of wonky stuff today. I am a fan of this sort of stuff. I will first say out loud, I am not an attorney, nor am I a tax accountant. So if you have questions during this presentation that are more relevant for an attorney or a tax accountant, then please go and chat to someone else. I will not be giving tax advice or legal advice. I actually went for the MBA and purposefully did not sit for a CPA because I did not want to do the tax accounting portion. So I'm not a tax accountant, just throwing that disclaimer out there first and foremost. I do, however, have an MBA and 2 masters. Yeah, I am a bit of a student. I would like to actually go back and, you know, even finish a PhD, get a little floppy hat. It's kind of my thing. But they are relevant to this conversation today because they are in finances and financial history. So a master's in financial history. So that's kind of specific, but exciting for me. I've worked a lot of different places, mostly nonprofits, but also in the for-profit world where I was a consultant for a lot of C4 organizations for about 10 years, mostly political parties, federal candidates, and federal PACs. So when we start talking about C4s, I do have a lot of experience managing C4s, especially their finances and compliance. I do have my own LLC. I have 2 of them. One is Bluebird Strategies. That's mine. It's a sole proprietorship. Another one is JAM Strategies. I have that as a partnership with a friend of mine. So when we start talking about the different types of for-profit entities, it's just helpful to know that I have actually lived and breathed some of these in my personal life as well. I have been with the Unfunded list, like I said, for about 5 years. And in 2017, I worked with Dave to file our 501c3 paperwork to get our official status. So again, trying to cover the basics, a lot of backgrounds in C3, C4, and for-profit entities. All righty, so we want to go to the next slide. Awesome. Today, we're going to be discussing 2 different types of structures, your legal structure and your kind of business structure, business model. The legal structure refers to kind of how you're taxed. What is your legal kind of structure, your legal background? Your business model is really more related to how are you going to pay for things? How are you going to raise money? How are you going to spend money? What are you allowed to do? So when we're talking about these, one thing to keep in mind is you can have one business structure and one legal model. And they don't always have to match together. You might always think that a C3 has to only go after grant funding and can never have a fee for service. That is not true. On the flip side, you may think that a for-profit entity can never get grants. That is also not true. So that's a couple of the things we're going to try and break down here today to quash some of those stereotypes about legal structures versus business models. All right, so next slide. Yay. So here's where we start getting into a little bit of the specifics. Most of you on the call probably work for a 501c3. You've worked with them. Maybe you fund them if you're a funder. This is part of the, and Dave mentioned earlier, part of the 501c code that lays out fundraising and management of public entities. So a C3, it's a legal model that is, you might think of them along the lines of hospitals, foundations, universities are 501c3s. The unfunded list is a 501c3, which means that donations to us are actually tax deductible. That is one benefit of being a C3, is that folks who donate to you can deduct that amount from their taxes. I'm just gonna say it one more time for the Zoom folks in the back. Tax donations to the unfunded list are tax deductible. That's right, just throwing it out there. The link is on the website in case you wanted to take advantage of that. That is one of the benefits of being a 501c3. You do pay some taxes. So Dave mentioned earlier in his conversation that C3s pay employment taxes. So just because you work for a C3 doesn't mean that you don't pay into your federal income tax, your state income tax, Social Security, all of those. But you are exempt from some types of taxes. Sometimes we get tax benefits when we go in to buy certain things. Sales tax is often exempt for C3s, although there is additional paperwork to get done if you want to take advantage of that. He did mention, filing in certain states. As a C3, make sure that you are registered in the states in which you are fundraising, or that you do want to take advantage of the tax exempt status for that state. For instance, if you are purchasing items in Florida, and it's a Florida company, but you are not registered as a C3 in Florida, you may or may not get your taxes waived in Florida for that purchase. So just a couple of things to think about. You do have some tax benefits for being a 501c3, but there is often some paperwork, just some background to be done to do that. They file 990s. So you saw several 990s this morning. This is what kind of tells the public, you are a public charity as a C3, you are doing things for the public good, and therefore the public has kind of the right to know, what have you been up to? How are you spending the money? What are you doing? And that's what the 990 does. It says, here's how much we've raised, here's how we've spent it, here's where it's going, here's the work we're doing, here's what you're getting for this work. There are no shareholders. They often have boards, and the organization is beholden to the board. The board has very important governance structures. That's kind of their role, is to manage the activities of the organization at a governance level to make sure that they are abiding by all of the laws and regulations of being a C3. So again, I know a lot of you probably work for C3s, and so this is probably the one model that we'll be discussing that you are most familiar with. But it's important to walk through it just because I think it's helpful in comparison, especially with some of the other entities that we'll be discussing. So if you want to go to the next slide. Awesome. A C4. So you're thinking, well, how many are there? There are a lot of the C structures. 501. There's various types of entities as you get through the 501c code. The C4, I mentioned earlier that several years of my life, I spent working for political parties, candidates, and PACs. A lot of those are C4s, right? So they are associations, civic leagues. They are for the public good, but they can have a lot more flexibility when it comes to their political speech. So one of the things to be careful of as a C3 is that you have very strict limits in what you can say in a political format. When you're a C4, you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what you are allowed to do and not do. Unfortunately, for most cases, tax donations for C4s are not tax deductible. So that is also another important characteristic. I will say that a lot of organizations, especially larger ones, will actually have a C3 and a C4 arm. That's something that you see a lot. If you look at RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, they have a very active C4, which lobbies for programs for survivors. And they have a very active C3, which is very much the hotline and the patient support services within the organization. Other organizations like the Pew Charitable Trusts have both a C3 and a C4. I remember I worked there for a few years, and it was actually a really important time every month, every quarter, when you have to go into Salesforce and mark down all the time that you spent on any sort of lobbying effort, because they had to make sure that because they did have the two arms, that they didn't go over a certain cap of how much people were working on specific lobbying endeavors. So that's not an uncommon thing to see both a C3 and a C4 in the same organization. It makes for some fun back-end accounting and operations to make sure that you are abiding by the regulations of both a C3 and a C4. But it does provide you a little bit more flexibility in what you're allowed to do in terms of politics, lobbying, and just general advocacy for your particular population. So, next slide. Yay, also, it's great. Fiscal sponsorship. This is one where if you are, as many of you may be, kind of walking through I don't really know if I want to be a C3 or a C4 or a for-profit. What am I supposed to do? And you may not want to take the plunge yet and actually go through all the paperwork of setting up your own 501c3. It is a substantial amount of paperwork. Right now, it's actually going fairly smoothly for most people who are applying for their C3 status. But it is an endeavor, it's an undertaking, and it's a commitment, because once you have registered, you exist and you need to file paperwork regularly, even if you don't really do much. So one of the things that some folks may choose to do instead of going through the paperwork initially is to kind of test the waters to some extent by being fiscally sponsored by another organization. This is someone who provides the accounting, the financial services for them, and may also provide, perhaps some back office operations or some space. They often provide just general guidance. They provide a place where you can actually go out and fundraise as a C3, and the fiscal sponsor will take the funds in for you. This is also an option if you are a very specific, small idea that maybe only happens once a year. I can give you an example of the Fat and Greasy Citizens Brigade, which is a Shakespeare group I work with in DC. We only do one show a year. It is a free outdoor Shakespeare show in Georgetown, but it is a nonprofit idea. We're not going to go and set up our own C3, but we want to be able to accept donations, and we've actually gotten grants to run these shows every year. So we actually are fiscally sponsored by Fractured Atlas, and they receive the funds on our behalf as a 501c3. They do take a fee for doing that, to make sure that it's accounted for properly. But it does save us the hassle of having to develop our own 501c3, knowing that we're only going to use it one time a year for this one show that we want to do. So it is an option if you're either, again, testing the waters, or you have a very specific need that having a full year-round 501c3 is not the most logical or efficient method for you. Although they do have benefits, if you do think that you want to be a long-term 501c3, I would start that paperwork. It's not something maybe you want to be fiscally sponsored for years and years and years. Because if you're going down that road, it may actually just be more efficient to be your own 501c3. That way you have control over your own income. You don't have to pay fees to anybody. And you can kind of manage the organization the way you need to and you want to. But again, it provides an opportunity for folks who, again, want to test it out or don't have the need for a larger organization. Next slide, please. That's so much fun. All righty. So we talked about the nonprofit side, and there are actually many more examples of the nonprofit world. When you look into like religious organizations, some other types of the C code, 501c code, those are the two most obvious, the C3, the C4, and then your fiscal sponsorship. But by no means are they the only options. So now we're going to turn a little bit to the for-profit legal structures. And these are going to be the ones where you actually own an entity. So there are three traditional types of corporations. And this is what I was saying earlier, I have a couple of these, so I get to speak in personal ways about what the ins and outs of managing the different types of corporations. The one that everyone is probably most familiar with, so the big companies that you see out there are going to be your C Corps. It's just a traditional corporation. It is taxed as a corporation. So the entity itself is going to be taxed for the income that it makes, right? It has shareholders. This is an important distinction. In fact, I remember super fun times growing up because my grandparents were shareholders of CSX. And so the shareholders meeting every year was at the Greenbrier. So it was great fun for me to get to go to shareholder meetings. So that CSX corporation, it has shareholders. There's no cap on the shareholders. You can have 10, you can have 1 million. Usually these are within your own bylaws of the organization itself as some sort of cap, but there's no legal cap through the IRS. The duty, therefore, is to your shareholder. So, CSX, sorry, that would be the little sniffles coming through. Yeah, the train company, choo-choo. So the duty, therefore, is to the shareholder. So if you're in a board meeting or if you're working at the corporation, you're going to make decisions that are in the best interest of your shareholders. They're the ones you report back to at the end of the day, right? So that's an important distinction, honestly, between all three of these, is that decisions made for a C Corp corporation are in response to your shareholders. Shareholders are taxed when they receive funds from the organization. You may receive a dividend. That may be something that, set up every month, every quarter, once a year. Some of them don't have dividends and you only get funds after you sell the shares that you own. And so at that point, you would pay taxes on the amount that you made from selling those shares. So this is, again, an important distinction of the taxation of a C Corp corporation. The entity itself is taxed. You as a shareholder are taxed either when you get dividends or when you sell the shares. That is how taxes are managed for that particular type of corporation. I'm actually going to skip down to the B Corp now, just because it's the most similar taxation-wise. So this is for a public benefit. This is a public benefit corporation. This is the one where if you are on the fence about being a for-profit or a nonprofit, and you might say, I really want to do something for the social good, but I have a for-profit business model in my head, this may be what you're looking for. It is also a corporation. So it is a for-profit entity. Like the traditional corporation, the entity itself is taxed, right? So the actual company. And this one, it has shareholders. It does. But it also has stakeholders. So in this case, your duty is to your stakeholder. These are likely the recipients of your service. If you have set up a for-profit water delivery service in a neighborhood, and you are a B corporation, Your stakeholders are the people who are receiving the water being delivered, the clean water. The shareholders may be someplace else completely altogether. And while they have input, and obviously they want to see you do well, the responsibility of the company at that point is to make decisions that are responsive to the stakeholders, to the recipients of the good works that they're doing. Technically, this may be in contrast to what is good for the shareholders. You may actually have that as an instance where the decision being made is, in benefit of the stakeholder, but actually will be a detriment to the shareholder in terms of, what they get to take home at the end of the day. But for a B Corp, it doesn't matter. You are beholden to the stakeholder. They also file an annual benefit report. So in addition to, traditional taxes, again, where the entity is taxed, you have to file a report that shows how you have improved the social good over the course of that year. So it's, kind of like your annual report that you would file if you're a nonprofit. You are probably used to seeing those. You do your annual report of here's the good things we did this year. Here's all the people we helped. Here's all the causes we supported. A B Corp has to do something similar and actually file it at the federal level to say, we're a benefit corporation. Here's all the good we did this year. So again, a small distinction there with the corporation. And then the third type of corporation, again, these are three of many, but these are the most traditional, is an S Corp. This is the one I'm most familiar with. I have two of them. These are pass-throughs for taxes. So the entity of an S corporation is not taxed. Bluebird Strategies, JM Strategies, we file taxes. We're not taxed as Bluebird Strategies or JM Strategies. Margaret is taxed. So I get a report. I write the report, but I get one. I get a K1 from JM and other just 1099s from Bluebird that I show on my personal taxes as income to me for that year. So it doesn't, really matter what the entity does. I show my portion of it on my personal taxes. The companies themselves are not taxed. They have some general registration fees, blah, 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 that sort of thing that you just to keep the entity alive, the company alive, that you pay. But in terms of taxes, any income tax is on me, not on the entity itself. Shareholders are taxed directly for a percentage of their income. So this is for JAM Strategies. There are two of us. When we set it up, we wrote the operating agreement to be a 50-50 split. Therefore, at the end of every year, whatever income came in to JAM Strategies, we each get a K1 for 50% of that income that we then report personally on our taxes. The LLC, the LLP, as it mentions here, are two of the common abbreviations that you might see for an S Corp, just because, they often are limited liability. And technically, JAM actually is an LLP, but it is registered as an LLC. A lot of folks will do this. You might be like, well, I'm paying taxes anyway. Why on earth would I go through the trouble of setting up a corporation for myself when people could just pay me? And that's true. People could also just write checks to Margaret or Jody, but it does provide a level of protection. So those two important words right there, limited liability, protect me as a person. So if something were to happen and I were to get sued, perhaps by someone with Unfunded list or someone else that I work with, because I'm being paid through the entity, they can only sue Bluebird for as much as Bluebird has in assets, not however much Margaret has in assets, which is an important distinction because, I like having that little bit of protection there for myself. And so I think that's why you might see a lot of sole proprietorships and partnerships go through the trouble of creating these sort of things. When you get a K1, do you pay your taxes at the income level? Yes. So actually, fun times for an S Corp, especially if it's just one or two of you. I have been told by my accountant, and every accountant might be slightly different. Right, I'm constantly getting sued. You can usually what I will do is I will budget out for the year, and I actually have a really fun, detailed tracking spreadsheet for taxes that I fill out every month and then compile every quarter that calculates for me how much I should be paying in federal and state taxes based on the income I received that quarter. And so I actually pay estimated taxes on that every quarter. So that then the K1 at the end of the year shows the aggregate that I've made through that entity for the year. And I report that on my, on my taxes. Yes, it is at the overall income level. So if I made 20,000 from JAM and 20,000 from Bluebird, then I will pay at the $40,000 level, if that makes sense. Oh, interesting. In Kenya, you need a registration with an NGO and yearly returns. So yeah, so for a corporation, that is interesting. I do imagine that, for nonprofits, you definitely need a yearly registration. You do in the States as well. Definitely something to keep in mind. So these are the three main types of corporations. Again, there's lots of overlap in the C Corp and B Corp. The distinction is the duty, where's your duty for those two. And then you have the S Corp, which is kind of the most likely for an individual or a small company to be registered as. All right, next slide. Awesome. Okay, so this is actually just a list. I mentioned there's two different types of nonprofit entities we walked through, three different types of for-profit entities we walked through, but there are 16 to 20 different hybrids in the middle. There are so many different options that you have, and we're not going to go into every one of them. That is actually a presentation we talked about doing, and then I thought, who's going to sit on a call with me for 3 hours while we dig into 16 different types of legal models? I mean, maybe someday. But this is something that, as you're starting to think through what type of entity might be right for you, just take a look at the many options that there are, that you do not have to be siloed or pigeonholed into a very strict idea of what one is, that there is a lot of flexibility between different types of organizations, companies, and everything in between. So this is just a listing of them. We can also share this with folks just because it is a kind of a cool graph to show the different options. All right, next slide. Great. So small typo, there are 6 questions here. It says 5. I do math all day, but I apparently can't count. It's okay. Don't hire me to do your taxes, like I said. So there's a couple of things, as we talked about, when you're thinking through what type of entity should I be? So you have this idea and you're thinking, okay, I want to change the world and I have all these ideas of how I'm going to do it. But am I a for-profit? Am I a nonprofit? What am I supposed to do? There are a couple of things that I ask for you to keep in mind before you choose any of these. Because at the end of the day, the choice may actually be none of these. So well, the first question I really want you to spend some time on is this work already being done? This is a biggie. And someday, I'm still in the middle of writing it. I promise you will see a blog post from me entitled, "Are you going to crush my dreams?" And it comes from a conversation I had with an individual who was so excited about an idea they had. And they were going to start a nonprofit to fix this problem. And I spoke to them and I said, it's a really good idea. It's a big problem. I used to work at Pew and they actually have a program that's doing this. Please let me put you in touch with them because they have a lot of resources behind them. They've already gotten started. And his response was literally, "Are you going to crush my dreams?" Because his dream was to start a nonprofit that would fix this problem and not just to fix the problem. So I ask you, if you have an idea, to really do your research. Is this work already being done? Is there an existing organization, nonprofit or for-profit, that you could partner with? Maybe they're doing things a little differently and you can provide a niche service to them, or you can help them think of doing it in a different community. There's likely someone doing something that maybe you could help with before starting an entity of your own. So that would be my big first question to you. Is someone else already working in this space? And if so, can you work with them somehow, some way? Or if nothing else, at least ask them questions and perhaps get some advice. The other thing to think about when you're choosing the type of organization, the type of entity, is where can I find my first funding, right? So not forever funding. Where's my first funding going to come from? Is it going to come from shareholders and venture capitalists that are going to give me some startup funds? So maybe looking at a for-profit entity. Is it going to come from grants because I'm going to be able to write this grant because my idea is perfect for this funder? Perhaps it's a C3. Maybe it's from donors. Maybe there are just lots of people out there who want to give you $10 and $50 at a time to help your idea go. So again, just thinking through, where am I going to find my first piece of funding? And that will sometimes dictate the type of entity that you're going after, because that's going to kind of drive where that money is coming from. Can you offer a product or service at a market rate or below a market rate and still fund your activities? So this is especially important if you're thinking of a for-profit entity. Just thinking through, again, are other people already doing this? And can you provide something at a better rate, a better cost than what they're already doing? And or maybe you can fund it that way. If your first foray into funding isn't from individuals, it's by selling something, then that might dictate that you are a regular corporation, a C Corp or a B Corp. So that's one thing to think about. If your first range of funding is actually coming from selling something as opposed to getting it from donors or grants. What structure may help you attract the right people? So this is in reference to perhaps staff, donors, board members, shareholders, the people you want to bring along with your idea. You have this idea, and now you need to get people behind you, right, to make sure that they're on board with your idea as well. What structure is going to entice those first people who are going to support you, whether it's financially or with other resources? Is it going to be more enticing for them to follow you if you have a C3 and they can really get behind that nonprofit model? Or will they find it easier to support you if you're a for-profit and they go out and sell something? They help you get capital in the door. So it's kind of like the first funding. These are your first supporters, your first followers. What's going to make them want to follow you down the road? What relationships and partners do you need? And what are potential competitors? So again, as you're doing your research into who's already working in this space, you might see that people with the same idea are all B Corps. They've made it work. That's the type of work they're in. They're not getting grants. They're actually selling something, which is great. Can you partner with them? Are they going to be your competitors? Maybe you go in the nonprofit route because all of your competitors are in the for-profit realm and you want to stand apart because you're going to do things a little differently and go after grant funding instead of capital funding. So again, an important way to think through who else is working in that space and how can you either join them in the type of entity in which they're working or stand apart from them and how they're working. And then finally, like, what's your end game for eventual scale? And what model may help you get there. This is one where I have a case study coming up in a little bit where I will tell you to be careful, because if you pick one model early on, because that's where your funding is coming from, that's where your supporters are coming from, it may not be the model that gets you to scale. You may have to switch in between. You may start down one path of a nonprofit and decide that actually you should be a for-profit, that you're not able to make this nonprofit thing really work. You're not growing. You're not being able to motivate folks out beyond that first phase. So maybe you have to switch to a for-profit entity. But it is important to think through sustainability. I know we talked in the last session about how do you talk about sustainability, especially in the nonprofit space. This is something to think about. If you're looking at a nonprofit model or a for-profit model 10, 15 years from now, how do you scale that? Is it scalable in that model? So again, just a couple of things to think about as you're deciding how to take your big idea and turn it into a tangible entity that then you can go and change the world with. So next slide, please. Case studies. Alrighty, so I have 3. Open Gov Hub is our first one. That's where we are today. It's a delightful group of organizations that work in a shared office space. However, again, if you saw Dave's presentation this morning, you know that they are not their own entity. The Open Gov Hub is a program of global integrity. So they themselves, do not exist as a C3, C4, or for-profit. Global Integrity is a nonprofit organization. The business model, though, is to sell something. So Open Gov Hub gets grants, they sure do, but the bulk of their revenue is coming from selling office space, selling people the ability to come and work in this gorgeous environment. We have a desk here, so we pay a monthly rent to Open Gov Hub to have our desk, to have access to facilities, to have access to people who can support us during the rounds. So when you're talking about legal versus business models, I know we spend a lot of time on the legal models because that's really the part that you have to set up first. Really, that's the tangible piece to running the organization. However, your business model will come along. It may change. You may be a C3 and your business model at first may be grants. Your business model down the road may be fee for service. It may be down the road that you sell something altogether. So it's important to think through your legal model may not change, but your business model may. So Open Gov Hub right now is getting revenue from rents and from grants. I'm sure that during the pandemic, the revenue from their rent side probably went down, if I had to guess. People weren't in offices. So what do you do? And that's your revenue model, it's your business model. You turn to other business models, writing grants, trying to get donors to support you. So that's a unique example of an organization that is a C3 that makes their money primarily by selling something. When you think about C3s, you often think they have to get money from donors and or from grants. And it's anathema to sell something to raise funds for a C3. That is actually not the case. Open Gov Hub runs a delightful space here, and that is how they make their funding. So next slide. Street Sense. This is actually a super fun example as well. I am very close to this organization. It is a DC-based nonprofit. It is a street newspaper. It's written for and by the individuals experiencing homelessness in the DC area. Several years ago, I was the chairperson for Street Sense during a major transition time where we went from being strictly a newspaper where our vendors, the individuals experiencing homelessness in DC, would come every 2 weeks. They would buy the newspaper from us for 50 cents, sell it for $2. They had their income stream, we had our income stream. But for the most part, we were supported by grants, right? It was an organization we funded by, K-Fritz and a handful of other folks who gave us large checks to manage the organization. 50 cents at a time for a newspaper, it is an income stream. It was not sustaining, as an actual business model. During the time I was there, we transitioned quite substantially where we still get grants. They're still very supported by grant funding and by donors, but they also have not only turned it into a weekly paper, but they now sell services. One of the things that we did was create an almost incubator of digital services for the folks who were our vendors. We were trying to think of other ways that these individuals could earn money and take into account all the hurdles that they face in being homeless. It's very difficult to go for a job interview when you don't have any place to put, the rest of your baggage and you don't have an outfit. You can't just go and take a shower and clean up. So how do you present yourself? How do you get funding? How do you get money when that's your situation? The digital world is amazing. You can be a great writer and sit at a computer in a library and write blogs and work on websites and code for a living. And no one ever has to know what you look like. No one ever has to know that you sleep on L Street every night, but you're a great writer and you can sell that. So Street Sense Media became a bit of an incubator and now sells services from their vendors. The vendors can actually sell what they're able to do and Street Sense makes money off of that. So I think it's a real pivot point from an organization that was focused so much on grants and some fee for service revenue, but really has turned it, into almost a consultancy in some ways. People go to them and say, I need help designing this piece. I need help with graphic design. I need help with website coding. And they are able to have a cadre of vendors who can meet those needs and get paid for it. So it's a real interesting model to see what is the business side of this nonprofit and how it's changed over the years. Again, noting that you can be a nonprofit and still sell services, almost be a consultant in this world, which I know a lot of folks have those questions like, can I do that? Yes, you can. All right, next slide. Awesome. So 734 coffee. Not only is it delicious coffee, and if we were having this event in person today, Meng Yang would be here with his giant coffee pots, and we would all be hyped up on way too much of the delicious bean. I will say it is amazing coffee. I enjoy drinking it whenever I can. But this is an example of an idea that had to completely change course mid-course. They were originally Humanity Helping Sudan. They were a nonprofit. Meng Yang is a Sudanese refugee. He's one of the lost boys of Sudan and an amazing human being. He wanted to give back to his community, to the people still in the refugee camps. And so he started a nonprofit. I mean, it makes total sense, right? I want to help people. I start a nonprofit. I can get grants, I can have donors, and then I can send money back to my community to help them get out of their situation. And it did a little, to some extent. It still exists. You can Google it. We actually worked with them last year on the Sharing Award. It's a great nonprofit, but it wasn't bringing in the revenue and the ability to support people the way he wanted. So he diverged a little bit and created 734 Coffee, a for-profit entity. He sells coffee, and the proceeds, therefore, go back to Sudan. He wasn't able to have the impact he wanted with a nonprofit and had to, change horses midstream, as they say, and create a for-profit entity in order to achieve his goal. So that's something that I want everyone to keep in mind too. When you ask yourselves those questions and you're thinking through my first round of funding, his first round of funding probably came from a grant or a large donor who said, I want to help you do this. That's great. So initially, that nonprofit model completely made sense. As he started going through those other questions, that sustainability question, how do I keep this going from years and years to come? It wasn't working with that original business model of grants and donors. He had to find a new way to actually have the impact he wanted. And that's when he became a for-profit with the 734 Coffee. So it's one of those things where as you start to think through this, please answer those questions about the initial donors, the initial prospects, but don't be afraid to admit that maybe it's not working out. And that's okay. You tried. Do you know how people don't even try? So well done for even having an idea, putting yourself out there, thinking through what could work. If it's not working, take a step back and say, okay, is my legal model working? Is my business model working? Should I still stay a nonprofit but sell something? These are all options. And I think the point of this conversation today was not only to introduce you a little bit to the kind of tax background, the legal structures, all the nitty-gritty of these different types of entities, but to also show you that there is no one perfect way to do it. You have an idea and you have some questions. Walk through those questions and figure out what model works for you. It might be one of the 16 we didn't get to. It might be a hybrid of a bunch of different ones. You may have two. You may have a for-profit arm and a nonprofit arm, and that's all okay. I think at the end of the day, you have to do the entity, the model that is right for you. Knowing that if you are a C3, you can still sell things. If you are a for-profit, you're a B Corp over here, you can still get grants. There are a lot of funders who actually give grants to corporations. So don't be worried that you are incredibly pigeonholed by choosing one or the other. And don't be worried if you don't make it the first time. you can always kind of change course and figure out, if another model is right for you. I think that's one of the big takeaways that I've had to learn. It's an important distinction that I think a lot of people won't talk about because it seems scary and like they want to know they're right from the beginning. But it is an important piece of running an entity, running an organization, and having an idea that you want to change the world. So again, sorry, little allergies going on here. So that is my presentation, but I am here to answer questions if people have them. Again, if you have specific questions about taxes or formal like legal matters, please reach out to an actual tax accountant or an attorney. I am neither one, nor do I play one on TV or Zoom, but I can try to answer any questions you might have, or if there are other comments that people want to make. I'm here. So Jane is asking, does the IRS really monitor religious organizations for political speech and activity? I mean, yes and no. They're supposed to. In theory, religious organizations should not be saying things especially during election season, about politics. Most of them actually do. Funny story, in West Virginia, I actually turned a minister in the Methodist Church for preaching about the election at the pulpit. I thought it was not right. He was using religious time and resources to preach politics. And I did not believe that was what he was supposed to be doing. I was worried that the church might lose its status, because that is one thing that can happen if you are caught doing that. I don't think they crack down quite as much as they could, but it is something that you can turn churches and ministers, priests, whatever, in for doing religious things or political activities with religious resources. Anne asks, do you know why some foundations are moving from C3 to LLC? I don't know. I do know that there's, perhaps for some of the filing that they find it a little bit more flexible. They don't have to do the 990s and have audits. That is one part of being a C3 that is always fun if you are a larger organization. You have to go through your annual audit. If they're getting funding from certain entities, maybe it actually makes more sense for them to be a for-profit entity. I don't know why they would be moving from one to the other. That is an interesting concept that I would like to look into. So thank you for raising that, Anne. I hope you appreciated the shout out to Pew. Anne is one of my former colleagues at Pew. Nancy asks, how long does it take to set up a for-profit arm? The answer is, it can be done really quickly. I would caution against doing it too quickly. I would say take some time to think through the strategy, right? If you have decided that this is something you want to do, and you have your strategic plan, you have your idea of how it's going to operate, and you have your back office set up. I think that's the hardest part for most organizations that are nonprofits that want a for-profit arm, is making sure they have the right back office set up. So you have accountants who understand how to track both entities. You have a legal team who understands how to manage both. You have staff who understand that if they're working on one thing, it might be for the for-profit arm. If they're working on something else, it might be for the nonprofit arm. The actual process of setting up the for-profit piece, super fast, handful of papers, submit them. It literally takes minutes to hours to physically register your for-profit entity. I think that the important piece there is the strategy beforehand. Make sure you're not just jumping into it without really thinking through the ramifications for the organization, the current staff, current board, all this sort of things. Margaret from Dave, do I remember correctly that your old boss from DC Central Kitchen was focused on getting rid of the Johnson Amendment? Yes. So I don't know if any of you know Robert Egger. So he has been speaking very boisterously, a lot lately about lots of nonprofit issues. He also does believe in the ability for nonprofits to be able to speak freely, pretty much about anything they would like to speak about. is saying is no for-profits without nonprofits. So that is correct. Robert Egger has said a lot of things recently about changing some of the rules and restrictions around nonprofit management and what they are allowed or not allowed to do. So if you follow him, he has some interesting talks and speeches online about some of those. I know Dave saw one of them when he was at Solve, or not Solve. It was another organization that you guys were at, and he gave a speech about it. So definitely look that up if you're interested in some of the kind of trends from some folks in nonprofit management. Gabrielle, question. Most of the organizations need more than 3 years of work for grants. I see this as a great setback for startups. So you're saying, if I'm answering the question correctly, that for a lot of grants, they want to see that you have 3 years of work already done before they'll give you any funding. That is some funders. I will say that's not all funders. Unfunded List has been very fortunate to have some funders who have supported us from the very beginning. If you have an idea, you may have funders who are already ready to give you money from the beginning. And that's part of the important research on the front end about who your donors and grants might come from, because you might have some entities that don't require that and will give you some kind of startup funds as a nonprofit for general operating support if you present the idea and it's really in their wheelhouse. So it is unfortunate some funders won't give funding until you have proof, but then you can't actually get proof of concept until you have funding. It is unfortunate that that's an issue within the nonprofit space. If there's anything that you can show either from previous examples of work that you have, as proof of concept, even if you have 3 years of proof of concept, if you have any sort of rounds. I know, with the first several rounds of Unfunded List, we didn't have 3 years, but we had several rounds that we could show. This is how it's worked. This is how we've grown in 1 year, doing 2 rounds. Sorry. Oh, so Jane was asking about the Johnson Amendment, and Dave just reminds everyone that it's about political speech by nonprofits. That's correct. So they rarely get sanctioned, unfortunately, and it's become a trend I see from the pulpit a lot more, and all denominations, which is too bad. Looks bad for the government to try and find, yeah. It's true. I mean, you want to censor a church, but at the same time, the churches that do follow the rules then don't get a say. So there are pros and cons to what Robert has to say about the Johnson Amendment. Unfortunately, there isn't a real big crackdown. So some folks just get away with it and are able to speak freely about anything. It's interesting because when you talk about C4s, in a previous life, again, I worked as a campaign consultant and worked with a lot of C4s on their compliance and federal financial reports. And that is one entity as well where there's not a lot of oversight in what is going on with some of the political entities. And you have the Citizens United, which allows corporations to essentially engage in political speech without limits. One of the big, you have all over the place. Again, this is kind of my soapbox on campaign finance, which is different from this, but they are C4s. Most campaigns are registered C4s. Is that it's very hard to compete when you are a registered PAC or a federal candidate or a state political party, where you have very, very strict limits on what you're allowed to spend in order to get the message out about candidates or issues. And then you have corporations who are actually allowed to spend unlimited amounts on political speech. So that is also one issue with the C4 designation. That is true. 527s. I worked for a couple too. We had some clients who were 527s and we had to file their financial and compliance reports. They do not exist anymore. Now you have super PACs, which is always fun. It's a whole other world of finance and compliance when you're thinking about campaign finance and campaign compliance. So if you are thinking about starting a nonprofit, really think through the different types of nonprofit entities. So, any other questions, comments? If you think of any, or something that you would like to have seen, feel free to reach out. We do this conversation quite a bit. We've done it in the past with a partner of mine who talks a little bit more about the business models. So if there are things that we didn't get to that you have questions about, I'm happy to answer those offline if I can. I hope you did learn something today, because I know this is a bit of a wonky type of presentation, and I'm actually impressed that I stopped talking after like 40-ish minutes, because I could probably talk about this for hours and hours on end, because I find it fascinating, all of the different types of entities that there are and the distinctions and misconceptions. That could be a whole presentation in and of itself, the misconceptions that one has about the for-profit and nonprofit space. So thank you guys for joining today. Again, hope you enjoyed it and were able to understand despite the wonky allergies coming through. So yeah, so thank you guys. Oh, there's a question. Oh, okay, got a question. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. We have our next session is at 3 o'clock, I believe.
Okay. You can speak.
I got it. Margaret?
Yep.
They turned on the mic so I could ask my
Yes, excellent.
ask my
Question.
with my voice. So as you know, the Unfunded list is a 501c3. You file the various reports that we have to do. I think there's something that's due every May. I seem to vaguely recall he's signing something.
Yes.
After, of course, thoroughly looking over. But we have I think if you are going to be a C3, it is important, even though we have Margaret, who obviously knows a lot about this stuff, we work with a firm to make sure our filings are correct. So Margaret has to do a lot of work, works everything, but we have a comptroller, 100 degrees. I can't recommend them enough. They do a really great job. I always feel very comfortable with the paperwork. So anyway, you've been doing it. You're a little bit more familiar with the paperwork than I am because of that. And you helped me file the original 1023. There was a question about how long it takes to set up a C3. That I've helped a lot of folks file that original paperwork, and it's different every time.
Yeah.
I've seen it take years, especially if you get something wrong and they come back to you and make you correct it, then it's going to take you a really long time before you actually have that letter. So you want to get it right the first time, which unfortunately we did. I think it took us I want to say 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
I'll get to a question eventually.
Fine.
I know I mentioned in there recently, Marina got hers in 3 weeks. So I think it is happening really fast now. And I think that's actually because the IRS doesn't have a whole lot of staff. And so we are going to talk about it will be a double-edged sword if we were to fund the IRS better. It might start taking longer to form these organizations. But again, it's a tax exempt public charity. It should let's take our time, make sure it's all correct. I don't mind it taking a little bit of anyway, my question for you, right? You did the original filing, you've been doing the filing since. In the beginning, I was considering all the same questions as everybody else. I even thought about making Unfunded a for-profit consultancy. Do you think that we're working with the right business model and legal model at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Way to put me on the spot, Dave. Thanks.
I had planned to ask you this question for weeks, and I could have told you. Could have told you about that, and you'd be more prepared. But
Okay, no, actually,
this would be more fun.
It's actually an interesting question, and it's one that we've talked about a lot, because when you apply to the Unfunded list, you submit a proposal to us. You are often charged $100, right? That is a business model that we could ramp up how many proposals we take in and actually people pay for every round. And that is a line item on our budget, is the income from those proposals. However, it is not our main business model. Most of our funding does not come from that. It comes from grants. And I actually would argue that that is, for us and what we do and kind of the way we want to do it, is the better business model, is going after larger dollar amounts and either grants or co-review partnerships, which turn out to be grants for doing co-review, then trying to make a business model of a fee for service, a fee for proposal review work. because it's not sustainable, it's not efficient. At $100 a time, we'd have to review, I mean, that's a lot of math. That's a lot of proposals every round in order to make any real money from that.
We would need thousands every year.
We need thousands. And so for us, I do think that focusing on the business model of grants and working with co-review partners to give us grant-like funding is the appropriate business model. And I would not argue for going more towards a fee for service or pay per proposal business model, because I just don't think that would work for us.
Great. And I generally agree. Margaret and I check in regularly and have discussed exactly that before. It's useful to talk about it in front of the folks. Because this is a question like, people ask all the time, how do you guys pay for all this? You mentioned it is grants. I would say grants and donations from evaluators.
Right.
When we get those grants, it's because one of the evaluators is connected to a grant making organization. So it is I would say our business model is making sure evaluators see value in the experience, because that's when money comes to us. Which is that's something to think about. If we were making money from the folks we're helping fundraise, then we would make money when we help them raise more money, right? It allows us to give the current model. I think allows us to, especially in our report discussions, right? We can be neutral about the future of their proposal, right? Which is
Exactly.
I envision us as becoming eventually like an institution, right? A known thing. Everybody who's writing a proposal knows about us. We exist permanently to give the candidate feedback. And if we were constantly having to chase money, do sales, those sorts of things, we would, one, like lower quality proposals, the more startup stuff, we wouldn't be able to pay us, and we would turn away from that. This whole town's full of fundraising consultants. We heard from some very talented fundraising consultants earlier today. We had a lot on the committee. I'm actually a big fan. I think if you're fundraising, you should hire one of these talented folks. I look forward to one day us having enough money to hire one. I'd hire all three of them. But if you're doing that work, right, you have to be showing results. You have to pick your clients right carefully. You can't give feedback to a group you disagree with, really. And so this is what we're doing now. I agree. Like, the model allows us to be more of a public charity that exists because it's supporting the public, and that's why it makes sense. I'm sorry to take up so much.
You're fine. That's great.
Anne has pointed something out. Yes, exactly. Right.
What Dave was saying, yeah.
In the report discussion, just to Anne's comment, right? Sometimes the folks who paid $100 will show up very entitled, right? Like, if I don't get them a grant for their $100, like, that means that I should have to return the money, right? The $100 doesn't begin to cover the administration of putting one of our reports together. It takes an awful lot of time, plus the time it took us to recruit the evaluation committee with hundreds of members on it and all that. So, if we had to, and also I would be thinking about cutting negative reviews, right? Things with it and doing that sort of thing. I would also, really be prioritizing getting these things funded when I'm making the assignments. And I don't really have to do that now. That happens, but I get to prioritize who would give the best feedback, not who's most likely to find money for them. Those are two different questions. So, and this is very cool. I always enjoy hearing from Margaret. I get the chance to have a session like this pretty much every week, often with empanadas or tacos. If you look at our budget, there is a taco line item. Anyway, are there any other questions from the? I know this is a topic that does come up a lot for folks.
Well, thank you guys for joining me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium. So, and feel free to reach out, and we will, if you have questions or comments that you would like to share. So, thank you guys.
Very good. Thank you, everybody.